The darkness comes, an eternal darkness based fic. Chapter 8. Hell Breaks Loose. Yvette Cale followed Amber down the hallway that had been a side path. Even at first sight, it was a path that only the most curious would notice at first. It must have been another precaution set up by the goddess in this area. No doubt it was done to make sure that whatever was here remained safe from the wrong hands. Inwardly, she wished that her husband was with them, but she figured those with them would be enough to protect them. Thankfully, there were no monsters or minions of Mantorok down this hallway. This bothered her, since a lack of that would cause them to drop their guard. It made her wonder if the goddess had her own creatures that she used. She had never heard of any encounters like with those of the other ancients, but it didn't mean they might not exist. Eventually, after their group took a few twists and turns, they reached a big chamber with a dais in the center. It was almost exactly like Richard's description of the pit chamber that was encountered in another portion of the Forbidden City area. The one difference was that the pit area was actually a tiled floor. There were other features in the room that looked completely in place like the rest of the features of the area, and that set her on edge. Alexandra Roivas was about to step forward, but Yvette held out her hand to stop her. When Alexandra looked at her, she just said, "We don't know if there are any traps put in place or not. I know it had the protection of illusion around the place, but if this was so important, I'm sure there would be other protective efforts in place." She then heard Marlene Jacobs agree with her. In some ways, Yvette felt sorry for Marlene getting stuck in this, but she did recall that her family had already gotten tied in with the fight against the darkness for years. "She's right. I do remember my great-grandfather remarking on it." Alexandra nodded at that, and then looked around the room. "I hadn't even thought about that. So far the goddess hasn't tried to hurt us, or at least not actively tried to hurt us." Yvette was thankful Alexandra amended her statement. The goddess wasn't above protecting the world from evil, even if it meant preparing to hurt those who would help her because it looked like they might go against her. She watched as Alexandra turned to face Amber Snow, who wore the strange glove of the goddess, and said, "Well, Amber, can that glove show us anything about traps in the room?" Yvette actually thought it was a very reasonable request. The glove did help lead them here. She watched as Amber looked at the glove, and then tried to wave it in front of her. They all waited for a moment before the young lady responded, "It doesn't look like anything happened, so I can't say if it did anything or not. I still don't even understand why it chose me." She could tell this upset Amber a bit, but she learned not to question the workings of the goddess. Yvette sighed, and then thought on what her father had taught her about excavations and spotting traps. Many trap tiles had a slight difference to the floor, and there would be openings for the trap mechanisms to work. Even the walls would have sections that could respond to pressure. Soon she started to see the spots on the floor that triggered traps. She even started to glance at the ceiling, trying to spot trap sections there as well. Even by her own judgment, she could see there was an outline of something in the area over the object that they were there to retrieve. It became more and more obvious that whomever constructed this area wanted to make sure that no enemy of the goddess tried to claim this item. She started forward, minding her steps and saying, "Step where I step." As she progressed towards the item, she glanced back to see the others following her lead. The closer they got, she noticed something. Some of the floor tiles, a slight distance away, were starting to fall. She glanced back and noticed that everyone was stepping on the panels she had been stepping on, and she inwardly smacked herself. No doubt Mantorok's forces weren't completely destroyed in this area. Either that, or all their weight was triggering the start of collapse. She noticed that Amber saw it as well and jumped forward. She was thankful the girl's jump got her to the dais, and the relic immediately responded to the glove, merging with it and giving it a yellow glow. Yvette now wondered what the upgraded glove would do now. Marlene Jacobs was momentarily blinded by the glow, but then she noticed how the floor was falling away. Immediately she turned to head back to the door into the chamber. "We better get going. This place is starting to fall apart. I don't think getting crushed is going to be beneficial to us or the human race." As she ran to the door, she noticed the others were joining her. She heard Alexandra say, "I completely agree, but I think getting crushed may be the least of our worries." She glanced back for just a moment and saw something massive erupt from the floor. It looked like a giant purple worm, but it appeared to be looking at the dais first. She could also see that there were horrible scars on it, no doubt from the explosions from so long ago. Once they were in the hallway, they all started running, and she heard Yvette say, "Mantorok must have been aware of this place, but couldn't get into it until we entered the place. The goddess had it well protected." She then saw the woman continuing to run with them. "No doubt the barrier hiding this place is starting to fall." Marlene looked ahead of them and wasn't surprised to see a crackling of yellow energy at the entry to the hall. The barrier was already starting to fall. There was no doubt in her mind that it wouldn't be standing much longer, and anything would be able to get them. In fact, she noticed that some sort of haze was already starting to coat the floor beyond the barrier. She then heard that the passage behind them was starting to crumble, and she picked up her pace along with the others. She heard Amber say, "We better not have far to go. The collapse is catching up to us, and I thought I heard something roar as well." As if to punctuate that statement, she heard something like an inhuman roar echo through the structure. This made all of them pick up their pace, and just as they passed the failing barrier, Marlene heard the passage behind them collapse. The collapse caused a cloud of dust to coat the chamber they had entered, and they were all coughing from the dust that was kicked up. They all looked up at and Marlene inwardly gulped as she realized they almost fell into the pit that led to Mantorok. She did not want to fall down that pit. She backed away from it for a moment and took a moment to calm herself down. She noticed that some of the others were doing the same. They weren't safe yet, however, since they had to make their way back to the portal home. She watched as the vet pulled out a gun and checked it, as Alexandra held up her gladius. She knew the two were ready to deal with anything that came at them. She then heard Alexandra say, "Let's get going. We need to get to the portal. The sooner we get there, the better." She couldn't argue that, and followed as Alexandra led the way back to the portal. Just as they got to the room with the portal, she paused as at the sight of the floor. It was coated with mist, but it was purple in color. She already knew what that meant. The room had one of those gatekeeper creatures, and out of instinct she got to the wall behind her and said, "Get to the walls." She noticed that they all paused before one of them looked back at her, and must have seen the worry in her eyes. As they did so, she heard a vet ask, "Wait, is this a gatekeeper situation?" When she nodded, she watched as they all did the same, trying to eye the room for some sign of the creature moving. They should have realized something like this was coming, since everything had gone a bit too smoothly so far. Alexandra Roivas looked over the room, trying to spot where this gatekeeper was. Prior to coming here, she asked Richard about the creature, and was not thrilled to hear it was invisible. She wasn't sure she could react in time like he had. They were going to need a way to reveal the thing. She watched the floor for a few moments, wondering if the others were also doing the same, but she didn't see any disturbances in the purple mist. Sadly, she had never had to face off against a gatekeeper of any kind, so she wasn't even sure if looking for some sort of sign that the creature was about was even an option. There had to be a way that they could find the creature. She dared a look at the floor, and noticed footprints from where they had stepped when they had arrived, and she had an idea. Whenever they had used the Reveal Invisible spell with Mantorok's rune, it turned them invisible to all. That didn't mean they weren't intangible. That meant the coating of dust would reveal the creature, allowing them to know where their foe was. She slowly knelt down, keeping her eyes forward, and said to the others, "Slowly kneel down and pick up some dust. I have an idea." In her peripheral vision, she saw the others doing the same as she had. Luckily, the gatekeeper didn't pick that time to strike. That could only mean that the creature was working its way over to them. Once they were all standing, she said, "All right, huddle in tight, and we'll stay along the wall. We want to minimize its chances of attack." She then urged them to work their way around the wall. It didn't help that they didn't know where in the room their invisible foe was. She paused for a moment and threw her handful of dirt in front of her. As she did so, she saw the others doing the same. The result of this action was nothing. The dirt fell to the ground, concealed by the purplish mist around them. She crouched down yet again to grab some more, keeping her eyes focused in front of her. Every second she felt she was being watched, and the invisible monster was getting closer and closer to them. They all moved closer to where the portal was, and she was thankful that the invisible gatekeeper hadn't ventured through it. It was very possible that the goddess had protected the portal and kept the creature from getting through. She just hoped they would spot it before it attacked them. After another moment, she again threw the dirt, and this time it had stopped right before her. In that instant she went to raise her gladius, but it was too late. The creature, knowing it was exposed, attacked, and she felt a searing pain in her shoulder. Most likely her reaction was enough to spare a jab to her heart, but still it had drawn her blood. In that moment 3 things happened as she fell back in pain. First off, the creature was starting to summon some sort of creature. She didn't know what it would be, but since she heard at least one Pargan rune, it was going to be something bigger than a trapper. The last thing they needed was another creature that could attack them. She honestly didn't feel like she could handle a horror right now. The other 2 things that happened were simultaneous in action. Yvette had raised her gun and was unloading a few shots into the skull of the monster. The other was a blast of yellow energy that took away the rest of the monster's head. She just hoped it was in time to prevent the summoning spell from being completed. Amber was shocked when the gatekeeper landed its attack. Almost out of instinct, she raised the hand with the gauntlet on it and watched as a bright yellow light shot out. She had even heard a gunshot, and she was certain it had been Yvette firing the gun she had brought with. By the time the light ended, the gatekeeper creature was falling to the ground, and Alexandra was being held by Marlene. She noticed the mist in the room was starting to depart, and she turned her attention to Alexandra and noticed that Yvette was already keeping pressure on the wound. As the redhead did so, Amber heard her say to Alexandra, "Stay with us, Alex. Stay with us and try to say the spell." She quickly realized what Yvette was trying to urge Alexandra to do. For a moment, she looked at the gauntlet that was on her hand, and it glowed with power again. She was almost afraid it would fire another blast, but nothing happened. She then felt that this glow wasn't going to hurt, but heal. She turned her hand and placed it right on the spot, forcing Yvette to lean back. Soon, a yellow glow enveloped Alexandra from the gauntlet. Amber could also feel the pain of the injury, but as soon as it appeared, it disappeared as well. There was no sound to go with it, but she did feel the healing power do its job. She had to experience it as well, but it did the job it was meant to, and she was sure she could feel the wound healing under her palm. When the glow ended, she heard Alexandra gasp in relief. After a moment, she said, "That was not something I want to experience again." She saw Alexandra look around for a moment, noticing the mist was starting to disappear. That would mean they could head back soon. But then she heard some steps. She saw a look of terror cross the faces of Alexandra and Yvette. She looked around then and saw them. Multiple creatures about the size of a small dog, yet had somewhat of a scorpion-like appearance. To her count there were about 10. She didn't see any eyes on them, but she had a feeling that they would be able to pinpoint them the moment they made a loud enough sound. As she was looking around, she heard Yvette softly say, "Trap us. Too many for us to safely eliminate one at a time, since we don't know if there are any more other monsters here now." She looked at Marlene and noticed the woman was pulling out her own gun. As the girl was doing so, she heard her say just loud enough for them to hear, "Why not? We can take out 2 at a time." It seemed the sound was too loud, as all the creatures turned in their direction and started making a squealing noise and wagging their tails. It was a disturbing sight to see that. Alexandra answered the question, keeping her voice soft. "That's why they react to the first sound made. We'd be unable to coordinate the shots being fired at the same time. We also don't know how long we can wait for each one to calm down." She looked around the room, counting the trappers. She also noticed that there were sounds of other creatures obviously coming. Amber then looked over to where the portal back to Enga was, and noticed that it still looked to be there, but in the same sense, it wasn't there, like it was out of phase with reality. They couldn't escape that way. She returned her gaze to the group and asked, "What happens if they attack?" She listened as Alexandra replied, "Literally, you get transported to a sub-dimension of sorts. You can't use magic there, and you have to make your way to a spot that will return you to the point you were teleported from." She then saw that Marlene perked up at that. "So, if we use them and quickly get out of there, we will be able to escape. We just have to make sure that they all trigger at once." Amber thought the plan was crazy, but then realized it might actually work. She watched as Yvette pointed her gun at a point to the left of one trapper and said, They will attack all at once, and it is a suicide attack for them. So, they will wipe themselves out in the process. That also means they won't be transporting any other creatures to the trapper dimension to stop us." Amber then watched as Yvette fired her gun once, and then aimed to the right of the creature and fired again. In that instant, all the trappers she could see let out a magical blast that radiated out in circular ripples. As it happened, she saw all of reality start to change around them. The complex of underground structures that they had been in started to dissolve from her sight as a dark dimension took its place. She could see it was a bunch of island-like structures with some structures on them. Once everything settled, she looked around with the others and then noticed Alexandra pointing at one of the islands. As Alexandra did that, she said, "Well, good plan, except someone else is here." She looked in the direction and saw someone else was indeed here. To make matters even worse, Amber heard a hiss she had heard before, but no one else seemed to notice. She had a feeling this was not going to be a quick trip in this alternate dimension. Edwin Lindsay had been monitoring the transportation device while the ladies were gone. He had been studying it more and more, learning about how it worked. He had already figured out that it had a failsafe in it to protect those who used it, as well as a way of tracking those who went through it. A part of the panel he was at seemed to show 4 blips that were obviously in good health. Professor Percival Marsh, who had been operating it this time round, was checking readings related to the portal when Edwin saw a puzzled look cross his face. He watched as the professor then looked up at the portal and gasped. With that gasp, he heard the professor say, "Edwin, is it just me, or is the portal in a state that makes it look like it is here, yet not here?" He looked up and saw what Percival meant. The portal looked like it was only partially there. He then looked at where the blips were and saw that one had started to blink. He immediately realized what this meant and said, "It must be a threat there. One of them have gotten wounded or something." For a brief moment he was concerned that something happened to his daughter. He relaxed when he saw the blip stabilize, but still worried when he saw the portal had not returned to normal. He watched as Percival tried to work the controls, but it was obvious that the man was worried. "There must be something there that is being considered a threat. I'm not sure how to." Edwin watched the portal as it appeared to go into some sort of flux, and had a purple energy cascade through it. It rippled before disappearing, but he heard some sort of squeal at the same time. He was even sure he had heard that sound before, years ago, when he was in Angkor Wat. Once it hit him what the sound was, he turned to Percival and said, "We need to get Richard here, and we need to find out if we can follow their signal." For a moment, Lindsay was torn between running over to the console or running out of the complex. He knew he had to help his daughter, but he also felt that his son-in-law needed to be told about this and should be here as well. He was surprised when he heard his son-in-law speak. "I'm already here. I had wanted to see about something, but I heard the commotion. What exactly happened?" He turned to look at his son-in-law, and while his face wasn't showing it, Edwin could see the worry in the man's eyes. Percival started the explanation of what had happened to Richard. "We were monitoring things when the portal fluctuated. First it became both here and not here, and it appeared someone was hurt. After that the portal fluctuated again, and shut down as if they were no longer there. We still have some sort of reading on their health, but the portal appears to be closed and can't be opened at the location." Edwin then added the bit of information he had gathered when the portal closed. "Yes, but as it shut down, I heard the sounds of trappers. Something tells me there had been some there. They must have appeared after they arrived." He watched as Richard closed his eyes, taking all that information in. He had no doubt that his son-in-law was trying to think of something. After a moment he saw Richard open his eyes and ask an important question. "Is it possible to track their signals and open a portal there?" He had never thought about that, but it was very possible for the device to do so, in theory. He looked over at Percival, and he saw the man nod. "It would make sense for this thing to have some sort of tracking function, just in case someone is alive, but can't get back to the portal." He watched as the scholar started to study the device and push the occasional spot on it. After a few moments, he heard Percival do a few more things, and was glad to hear the man say, "I think I have it. I had to try a few things, but found what I think will work." With that, they turned to watch the portal as it came to life in front of them. Before any of them could see if they could even approach it, the portal quickly went on lockdown. This obviously made Edwin worry, as it meant there was something dangerous in the Trapper dimension. Richard Cale was not surprised when the portal went on lockdown once it was opened. He had already suspected something like this might happen. He walked over to the portal, not expecting to go through it, and felt the energy of the portal. It felt the same as that one point he had spotted earlier in the tunnels as they were expanding the protective barriers. In fact, it confirmed something he had started to suspect about that location. He did realize how the magic of trappers worked, and knew that anything sent to that dimension would, if it got through the dimension, return to the point it left at. It was that exact reason why he wanted to see if the portal device could lock onto that dimension. He turned to the others and said, "I'm not surprised. I came across a point just as we were going to expand some of the barriers around Enga. I think one of Mantorok's minions had an idea to get into the city. That, however, means that the ladies might be in trouble there, at least if they advance." He heard Edwin say something that crossed his own mind. "It might depend on what was transported over there. From what I recall, from you telling me, it is divided into 5 islands, and it is difficult to bridge those gaps. And the teleportation circles work one way." He nodded in agreement. Most of the creatures couldn't do ranged attacks, but he didn't know what creature or individual went over. He then looked at the portal and said, "Plus, we don't know what will happen if 2 individuals who were teleported from 2 different locations will go if they enter the exit teleport together. I'd also not like to chance that. Is there a way to bypass those safety features?" Inwardly, he was hoping that no one tried anything, but he also hoped no one would attack the other being there. He didn't want to go back to that spot and find pieces of people there. He was thankful when Percival said, "I think I can bypass the safeties, but I don't know how long it will be for. Just be ready for it when the safeties are shut off." He glanced back and saw the scholar starting to work at the console. He was thankful that Marsh was taking the time to figure this out. Still, each moment made him worry that he'd be too late. As he waited, he heard 2 more people approach. He looked over to see both James Malroy and Bishop Philippe entering the chamber. If they had been near the door to the chamber, he was sure they had heard about what was going on. Almost as if confirming his thoughts, he heard James say, "We'd just been passing by when we heard what was going on. I'm guessing all the ladies are trapped in the Trapper dimension?" When Richard nodded, he saw James hold something out to him. It didn't take him long to realize it was the gun they had given him. Before Richard could protest on taking it, James quickly spoke up.
I'm not going to need it here, at least not right now. I doubt you can enchant your sword over there. I remember someone saying that dimension is a realm you can't use magic in, unless it is already in your nature. This gun will be more useful to you.
Richard nodded, and then took the offered weapon. Philippe then walked up to him and said,
Richard, do you mind if I bless you before you head off? With how everything is going and all these revelations, I've been working on things and how it impacts my old faith.
Richard had been aware even after the last mission he was on that he had issues with his beliefs. If this was going to be something that helps him mentally, he wasn't going to stop him. He just nodded, while glancing at Professor Marsh, who was still working at the console. He then heard the bishop's blessing, and while he didn't know much of French, he was able to pick up on something. When he finished, he said,
Philippe, did you just include the goddess in your blessing?
When the bishop nodded, Richard smiled and said, You know, that blessing did help. I have a very good feeling this will go very well. He didn't want to say more, but he did feel like he had not only the goddess's blessing, but maybe even a boon as well. At that moment, he heard Percival exclaim,
I've got it. You better hurry. I don't know how long they will stay down.
Richard nodded and rushed into the portal, and instantly everything changed around him. He saw the strange dimension appear around him as he passed through, and he saw he wasn't far from the exit point. He also saw at the normal arrival point all of the ladies, but they seemed focused on a figure in front of him. When he glanced at that figure, who didn't seem aware of his arrival, he saw an outline around the figure that didn't mix well with it. He saw the image of a bone thief overlapping the figure before him. It was also the answer to his question, and he was going to make sure they didn't come back.